So I'm really excited to be here this evening. This is a topic I have never shared on before, so I'm super excited to, and a little nervous, honestly, to be sharing sharing on a topic that I have not presented on before. But we will get started. I still am unable to see my screen, so give me one more second. There we go. So we'll get started now. So a little bit about me. So when I think about who I am, these are some of my identities. And when I wanted to talk about shame and what it looks like, I thought about the fact that shame is often really internalized. It is something that you believe about yourself. Unlike guilt, shame is the things, the narratives that we tell ourselves that are negative, that are harmful. And so when I thought about my identities, these are the things that I thought about. I'm a Black female transracial adoptee in Reunion. I'm a sexual abuse survivor. I'm a birth mother, coerced into relinquishment as a teenager and now in reunion with my son. I'm a mom of 3 children who I raised and 1 that I did not. I'm a divorcee. I'm a wife. I'm a new empty nester. Woo! I'm an introvert. I'm an anxious. I'm an undiagnosed dyslexic. I'm a marriage and family therapist who has a therapist. I'm a speaker who worries when I share my story. And I'm a lifelong learner and will never feel like I have all of the answers. And so I wanted to share all those identities with you because a lot of those identities can bring shame. And so what I wanted to kind of talk about what I've done to get through shame, because it's been hard. It's been really hard to think about myself as an adoptee, as a transracial adoptee, as someone who's different in my family, as a divorcee, as a birth mother who had relinquished my son, and until probably 2 or 3 years ago, really believed that it was my own idea. And so this evening, I want to talk about how shame shows up across the constellation, and also how we can deal with shame and process our own shame. So in order to do that, let's talk about what shame is. Shame is a feeling that develops from the belief that you've done something wrong, bad, immoral, dishonorable. Shame can be chronic and fill you with the belief that the core of who you are is flawed. And so that's the difference between shame and guilt. Guilt is, I feel bad about this thing that I did. Shame is, I feel bad about the person that I am. But shame can be used in a positive way. Shame in a society helps us to navigate rules, to make sure that we follow societal norms. We don't do things that we would be ashamed of doing. So that's part of the useful uses of shame. But shame is a negative emotion and can be harmful when internalized. And our inner critic tells us that we are inherently flawed. So shame is all about who you are and how you feel about just your own existence. So guilt is that thing that you've done. I feel guilty for not having been able to support my firstborn child, versus I'm ashamed of being a birth mother. Those are 2 different feelings, 2 different statements. One is about the action and one is about what I believe about myself to the core. So I can feel bad about the action without feeling bad about my identity. So how do you know if you're feeling shame? So what does shame feel like? You can see on the slide. And shame feels like being worried about what others think about you. Shame feels like feeling like a victim or feeling rejected, feeling less than, feeling like you have lost yourself or lost your identity. Shame shows up when we want to be perfectionists and we want everything to be right. Shame is self-isolating. It's feeling left out. It's an inability to trust. And it looks like having no eye contact, having slumped shoulders, bad posture, being afraid to take up space. Shame looks like needing structure and predictability. Shame can come in forms of stuttering, and shame also can come in the form of masking. Shame can show up as being defensive or blaming others. It can show up in avoidance behaviors. It can show up in being overly apologetic. And it can show up in trying to never be the center of attention. That last one is something that I struggled with growing up. My mom kind of prided herself on knowing the fact that no matter what class I was put in, so if I was put in the honors classes, I would get a B. If I was put in middle range classes, I would get a B. And if I was put in the lowest level classes, I would get a B. And that was part of my never wanting anyone to pay any attention to me. And so I did just enough to get by, just enough to skirt by, even when I could do better. So shame comes in all of these forms. And for me, it really showed up as a child of never wanting to be the center of attention, always wanting to be the people pleaser, always wanting to be the person who makes peace. I was the youngest of four in my family, and my siblings are all very type A, very boisterous, really talkative. And I was always the one who was trying to make everything better and make everyone happy and trying to make just smooth all the things over. But shame can lead to addiction. It can lead to defensive behaviors. It can lead to bullying others, health issues, depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, an inability to trust, people pleasing, overachieving, compulsive or excessive behaviors, and withdrawn behaviors, and so much more. So there are many different types of shame, and I didn't list them all. I only chose a few that really show up in adoption. So the first is chronic shame, and as you can tell by the name, that's the shame that's with you all the time, And it's that voice that tells you that you're not good enough. It tells you that you're not smart enough, you're not cool enough, you shouldn't be here. Humiliation shame is usually a result of something happening. So you're being embarrassed by something in front of others. Humiliation shame usually is an event. So it happens, you're embarrassed, and then it's over. It's not chronic, it doesn't last for a really long time, but it still shows up in the adoption constellation. Social shame is feeling like you're different from others or that something is wrong with you, and it usually shows up in social anxiety. Identity shame is shame about who you are or that you are an inferior person. Shame from being exposed. So that's that unwanted exposure or being called out or having your story shared without your permission. Shame from failure is shame from not meeting expectations, whether those are yours or others. Exclusion shame is shame from being excluded from a group and feeling like you don't belong. And internalized shame is a result of feeling shame and making the experience part of your identity and relating your worth or lack thereof to that feeling. And so I want you to think about these different types of shame and think about how they've showed up in your life. I'd love for you to make a note, put it in your own notes, put it in the comments, and really think about how shame has shown up in your world and in your life so that we can talk about it as a group at the end of the presentation. When I think about the shame in my life, definitely shame about my identity, being a transracial adoptee, and also the shame of feeling excluded from my community. I had shame about chronic shame from being a birth mother. So much shame in my life growing up that I really had to process and work through. And there were some really big parts of my life that fueled that shame, the guilt of things that I've done, guilt of things I've said, even small things. I was telling a story the other day to a group of people about how one big lie, one blatant lie that I've told in my life was when I was in high school and my father, who was later diagnosed with bipolar disorder, was coming to pick me up from track practice. And I was hanging around talking to a group of friends and kind of trying to help. He would just give me a few more minutes. And he got out of the car and started screaming at me to come to him. And he was just screaming and embarrassing me. And I was just like, oh God, what do I do now? And one of my friends said, is that your dad? And I said, no, he's white. That's my driver. And I remember that guilt afterwards of like just disowning my dad in that moment because I was embarrassed. And so that just fueled more of that shame of who I was and how I showed up in spaces. So shame, all of these things are like an accelerant. Guilt, secrets, lies, expectations, microaggressions, public and industry narratives. And what I mean by that are, that can be, as an adoptee, someone sharing your story who isn't you, who doesn't have a right to share your story. But it also can be the way that the industry shares our stories as adoptees that don't actually represent who we are as adoptees, as birth parents, and even as adoptive parents. It's sharing a narrative that represents you, but doesn't represent you internally. So let's talk a little bit about how adoption shows up in the actual adoption lands. So when we think about adoptive parents, and I would love for you guys to kind of chime in, and I'd love to hear a couple people, if you're willing, to tell me, how do you think shame would show up in an adoptive parent? Any thoughts?
Hi, this is Emily. I would say the imposter syndrome. It's like pretending to be someone you're not and having to fake it and play the part.
Tell me a little bit more about that. Thank you. That's very interesting. Tell me a little bit more about that imposter syndrome as an adoptive parent.
Um, well, so I had a dad who adopted me, and I was trying, he died before I got to talk to him about his experience of being the adopted parent. But I read the 7 core issues of adoption, and that book really helped me process a lot and understand his perspective. And so I was trying to put myself into his position. And I remember talking to his sister about my background, his background, and just that there was so much shame because no one talked about that he was not my biological father. And he never brought it up in our 36 years together. It was just something that wasn't talked about. And um, I feel like he did love me as his own, but there was always this wall. Like there was always something that was there that wasn't fully right. So
Thank you.
that's my experience.
Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing your experience. And absolutely, with adoptive parents, there's a shame about raising someone else's child. There's a shame about feeling like you don't know what you're doing and are you doing the right thing. As a therapist, I have a client who is an adoptive parent who has told me, I stole someone else's child, and there's a definite shame that she's internalized about raising someone else's child. There also could be shame about issues of infertility, that failure, not being able to live up to expectations to have your own child. There's a shame around bonding often. There's a perception that you're going to get this kiddo and you're going to bond right away. And there's a shame that you can really internalize that something's wrong with me. Why is this kid not bonding with me, or why am I not bonding with them? So there are a lot of areas of shame around the adoptive parents that can show up in adoption land. And in adopt and birth parents, does anyone want to share where you think shame might show up with birth parents?
I can share mine. Birth parents, shame. I know for some of us, when generations prior, there was a lot of shame around getting pregnant out of being out of wedlock. There was shame in placing a child. There was a shame if you didn't have enough money to raise the child. I think that still goes on today. I know in mine, there was shame in reunion for the dirty secret. That, you know, I unfortunately hold my mother's shame to tell, her story, because she's pushed so much of her shame onto me that I am still paralyzed to tell people my true story. But in terms of her shame, um, it predominates our relationship so much so that we couldn't have one. She's unable to face the fact of her shame. She was going to get kicked out of college. She told no one. She is 70 years old and still holds that shame. So I think that's one way that it can affect birth parents.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. And yes, everything that you said, everything you said, shame in the secret, shame in not feeling good enough, shame in it's paired with that grief as well. And birth mother grief is that one grief that doesn't get better over time. It actually gets worse. It grows. So shame and microaggressions and things people might say, like watching a television show about adoption and you haven't told anyone that you're a birth parent, and someone says, I don't know how someone could give up their child. That shame and those secrets and in your identity and who you are, and not being able to do this thing that you wish you could have been able to do. And I think that what you described, Joanne, as that birth mother inability to kind of connect even in reunion is very common when that shame has not been dealt with, when those secrets are still secrets, and when all of those things are still part of their internalized identity. Thank you so much for sharing. And how does shame show up in adoptees?
I'll talk again. Sorry. I promise I won't talk the whole meeting. I think what I just said to you, like the shame of sharing her story, that I'll disappoint her. Shame that I don't fit into possibly either family. Shame that I don't feel like I look like anybody. Um, Shame I haven't been possibly, I guess, lived up to what they expected of me, on either side. Um, I'm sure there's more others that want to share, but those are the ones off the top of my head.
Thank you. Marcy, I saw your hand up as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about, I mean, you kind of gave us a cheat sheet in the beginning with your own list, but um so everything you listed. And I've been thinking a lot about this. As a child, I experienced shame, but I didn't know why. So I think young adoptees oftentimes grow up with the feeling of shame, but we can't pinpoint it. And that was my experience as a child, and then as an adult, kind of dismantling that and trying to figure out, okay, that was actually, adoptee shame. Has been a really interesting journey for me. And I think for sure, not looking like the people around me. I think there's something like hard to describe, but that having had to have been taken in, being a person that needed a charitable act is I think a big origin for shame that's harder to maybe put words to, but that's as close as I can get.
Absolutely. And it's definitely a shame that is portrayed in media and in movies and all in our books that we read, that poor kind of needing to take it in. So yes, April.
Hi. As a transracially adopted person, the shame of not being raised in the culture and not having enough of either one of my two racial identities to be seen as fully wholly those by those who were deciding that I ought to be fully or wholly those. So it wasn't often what I held as a belief. I would always I always rejected that. Like I rejected that idea, but it still felt shameful when I didn't have my words to defend against it. So like I've mitigated shame by having my words to thwart some of that and to debate it and to then to sit in my own identity however I see that. So it's been a journey of finding the language so that I could not feel ashamed that I couldn't articulate myself, because I knew what I felt inside, but I just didn't know how to say it and get the words out.
Yes, thank you. And we will definitely talk about that and having words to speak as we talk about how to get over some of that shame. Sarah, I see your hand up.
I think shame for not being happy. I remember as a child, I would often cry myself to sleep, and I would pray, and wish, I'd pray to God and be like, please make me happy. I want to be happy. But I didn't know why I wasn't happy. And then also just shame about not being white whenever like kids said racist comments to me. I never ever told anybody about that. I didn't tell my parents about it. It just, kept it to myself.
So there's this shame in the secrets and the things that you're keeping too. Thank you. Emily.
Yeah, hello again. In my case, so my mother had an affair. She was married at the time and had an affair with another man, and that's how I came to be. So there was a deep sense of shame because they were very religious. And so it was just something that you don't do. Like, number one, you're not supposed to have an affair. But number two, if you do that in the church, it's like a huge no-no. So I remember not telling anyone. Like I found out when I was 12 And that added to the shame as well. It's like the family that I grew up thinking was my family was not my dad was not my bio dad. But then having the church judgment on top of it all was really difficult.
Yeah, and you speak to that exposure, that being exposed in a way that is not you telling your story, but other people knowing your story. Thank you. And so, yes, adoptees experience shame and identity. We talked about that. We talked about exclusion. We talked about not belonging socially. We talked about those microaggressions, abandonment and rejection that's internalized. We talked about exposure publicly when parents tell their parts of the story or when other people know parts of your story without you sharing it. And also some of that disappointment of not being that ideal that you think that your adoptive parents may have wanted. So we go through all of these phases in our lives as adoptees, as birth parents, as adoptive parents, and then we get to a place of reunion or a place of even open adoption, and shame shows up there too. It shows up in exclusion because when you're in reunion, it's that feeling of you can never go home again. And so while you may be in reunion, you're not really completely included. Then it's exposing your story over again, whether that be you as a birth mother or you as an adoptee, or even with birth parents. It's not knowing if you're going to be rejected as an adoptive parent by the adoptee, as a birth parent by the adoptee, as the birth parent by the adoptive parent. And so what is that going to look like? What is belonging going to look like within a reunion community of reunion or even open adoption? And then what is your identity at this point? You know, if you're a birth mother, are you still a birth mother? Are you a mom? What do you become? How does this show up? And then again, all of those microaggressions also can creep up within our stories as well. So we've talked about what shame is. We talked about different kinds of shame. We talked about how it shows up. So what do we do with it? How do we process shame? So processing shame is really about learning to heal. And the first thing that I would suggest is being curious about your shame. And Marcy talked about how when she was a child, she knew that there was something there. There was that shame, but she didn't know what it was. So being curious about it, you ask yourself, what am I feeling? Why am I feeling this way? What negative messages am I hearing from, and from whom, and from where am I hearing these negative messages? Sometimes they're internal. What negative messages am I telling myself? And how can I replace them with positive messages? You bring your shame to light. And we talked about those fuels, those things that ignite shame. And one of those are secrets and lies. So bring shame to the light, befriend it, call it out, name it. This is identity shame because I was disconnected from my biological relatives and culture. This is exposure shame because my story was told by my birth parents as a child and I wasn't ever able to own it. Like, call out that shame, understand what it is, bring it to light. And then learning to accept ourselves, which is something we all need to do, no matter who we are, adopted, not adopted, old, young. Accepting ourselves is really that's the key. Self-acceptance is definitely the key. So accept it and yourself, because what has happened to us is not a reflection of who we are, but it's a product. If we are a product of what happened. So I'm not a reflection of what happened to me. I'm a product of what happened to me. I'm lovable just for being me and just for showing up. And you can do this in therapy you can do it on your own by journaling your experiences and being curious about what you're feeling. I love to write down questions throughout the day. If I have a question about something, if I'm feeling something, I'm getting really in tune with your body. And before this presentation, for example, I was nervous and I could feel it in my stomach. And so writing down a question like, why is this showing up in the stomach? What am I nervous about? What is the worst case scenario? And doing the same thing with your shame. What am I feeling? Why am I feeling this way? Where are these messages coming from? And going back later and answering some of those questions and really being curious about your shame and talking about it. But fostering acceptance often happens also when we're in groups. When we're in groups of people who can affirm us, who can affirm our identities, who can show us acceptance. So support groups, all of the support groups like AK offers, that can give you a place with people who understand your journey, who have journeys that are similar to yours, who can say, ah, I get that. Like, I get what you're feeling. I felt the same way. Who can give you words that you may not have had to describe what you're feeling, to describe your experience, to describe what you've been through. These affinity groups and coming to places of just communing with people and fellowship with people who understand your story and your journey are so incredibly important to processing shame. And it also gives you a place of people who can accept you and show you acceptance when you may not be able to accept yourself. So what defeats shame? All of these things: acceptance, honesty, therapy. I'm a therapist, so I'm going to say therapy 5 million times. Everyone needs therapy. Therapy, support, community, normalizing your experience. So being in these support groups and affinity groups and understanding that I'm not the only one, because often we live our whole life thinking we're the only one who's had whatever X, Y, and Z experience is, and finding people who are just like us, who have been through similar situations, normalizing that experience, understanding it by asking questions about what's going on, what you're feeling, why you're feeling it, where those messages are coming from, and then replacing some of those negatives with positive narratives, really being mindful of just sitting in mindfulness, grounding yourself in where you are in the moment, grounding yourself in your foundation and in your situation, and really grounding yourself in love. These are the ways that we really defeat shame. Really acceptance and honesty, like number one and number two. And then I would also say community and therapy. I'm going to say therapy, no matter, always therapy. These are some of the things that I like to tell my my clients actually in therapy is give yourself permission to take up space just as you are. There are many times when we are in a session and I can see someone shrinking a little bit from their experience or from their story, and I'll say, take up space. Allow yourself, give yourself that permission to take up space just as you are. Be authentic and unapologetic. And that means showing up in the same way all the time. Often as adoptees, we talk about being chameleons and showing up in different ways, but really the path to self-acceptance and getting rid of that shame is finding out who your authentic self is and showing up and taking up space unapologetically as your authentic self. There's freedom and honesty. Another thing that I'm saying all the time, there is freedom and honesty. And that doesn't mean you have to tell everyone your story and everyone all the sort of details of your story, but finding someone, a space, a therapist, someone who has a common experience to talk through your story. When you talk through those things, it takes away some of that ugliness. It takes away the scariness of something when you talk about it. Self-acceptance is so important. And one of my favorite quotes that I heard, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago in a workshop was, don't defend yourself, define yourself. And it's one of those sayings that you may not get when you first hear it, but at some point in your life, when you're in a place where you find yourself explaining who you are or defending yourself or defending your actions, you'll think back to this quote and be like, ah, I get it. And so defending yourself is taking a defensive stance. It's explaining, it's coming from an apologetic kind of view or a shameful view, while defining yourself is showing up authentically and just saying, this is who I am. One of the best examples I can give is when I was a principal, we had an occasion where the parent accused us of pushing a specific agenda on kids, which was not true at all. But what I did, instead of even defending my position or showing up any differently, I just kept my stance. I just kept going, kept the course, didn't change anything, didn't feel like I needed to say anything different. I was defining who I was and what I believed in and who I supported, as opposed to defending what I was doing. And then the final thing is transparency. Is one of my favorite things. Is transparency, it just kind of puts out the fire of shame because you're being honest. And one of the beautiful things that I found is that when you find people who you are in community with, who you can fellowship with, who have similar experiences, and you're able to be transparent about who you are and what you've been through in your story, and they accept you and love you and can say, yep, I get it. That experience right there is a huge way to just kind of squash shame and to just bring you to a place of self-acceptance and seeing that other people love you, and so you can love yourself. So, ooh, sorry, I went one slide too far. So I'd love to hear from you at this point. We have about 15 minutes and I really wanted to leave some time for conversation so I could hear about what are your thoughts about shame? What questions do you have about it, about healing from it, about processing it? How has shame impacted you? Do you have questions for me and how I've processed through some of my shame? I'd love to hear from you at this point. So Isha, I would love to open up for questions, and I wanted to just throw the slide up here really quickly so that you guys have a way to contact me, and we can put it up at the end again as well. But I want to go to full screen so I can see everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr.